Something as a kind of a background, I spent the majority of my professional career running planetariums, trying to take complicated subjects and translate them down for the average citizen to understand. Some time ago, while we were making observations of Jupiter, I started asking questions about what the heck is an event. That led to this talk. That was a mistake. One of the things that Francisco is going to talk about, for example, later, is something that nobody's mentioned this yet, or even talked about. And this is a way of putting something into perspective, especially if you're working with students. Talk about a typical S event. How many people in here is a ham radio operator? How many people do work weak signal work? Okay, stop and think about it. Jupiter mission, how far away it is, and we're listening to it on dipoles. An S event is the equivalent of a small nuclear explosion in energy. So keep that in mind when people are talking about these events. These are massive, enormous energy events. And we're just hearing them here. Imagine what they're like there. But anyways, we started with this question is, what is an N event? We know that there are three different types of basic emissions from Jupiter. L bursts, S bursts, and N events. S bursts are the shorts, L bursts are the longs, N events are the really long ones. But they're narrow banded. If you look for a definition somewhere in the literature, which you can find, typically the N event has been considered to belong to the category of L bursts, although the N event has a restricted frequency range. They're very narrow banded. And then if you keep looking, all of a sudden you find that they can be also L burst and S burst. And it gets more complicated and confusing than that. The emission regions, they've already talked about this, the IOA region, the IOA, IOB, IOC, and then the other areas, non-IOA, which would be this block, non-IOB would be this block down here, and then the non-IOC would be this block and this block up here. What's likely to happen where? I've never been able to find this kind of a chart anywhere, so I made one. If you look at all of the emission regions, L bursts are everywhere. S bursts, however, are limited to IOB and IOC. And it turns out that's where N events seem to also be limited to. An IOB region, IOC region. So if you look at let me see. You see that N events are associated with IOB, IOC. This shows also where the S bursts occur. And S bursts are also IOC, IOB. You know what an L burst looks like. You've seen lots of examples of those over the course of the last couple days. S bursts, and these are from my observatory. Again, you've seen many examples of these over the last couple of talks. And here's an N event, and this one I believe is from Hawaii.
That's UFO also.
Yeah, aren't these are oh, these are UFO ones.
Yes.
Okay, these are from UFOs. Let's see here.
Can you back up real quick? Put the where the event is the red one.
Yeah, this is an N event.
Gotcha.
Right across here. And this is also an N event. These are two different sessions. All right, IOB and IOC regions, where the N events typically happen in the yellow boxes. In this box here, and in the lower half of the IOB region, pretty much along this trace and in here, is where they typically are found. They're not typically found up in here. They're almost never found in the center region of the IOB region. in the IOB section. They tend to always occur in this lower area down in here. IOC, it doesn't seem to make much difference.
How do you know that they're generated in that area?
I'm sorry?
How do you know they're generated there where you're showing Jupiter?
Because when I've got this is an image of Radio Jupiter Pro. And if I'm seeing an N event, that's where Jupiter's going to be.
Okay, I understand. Thank you.
This is a probability map of where N events typically happen. This was a Rahima diagram here on the left. The one on the right here was by Oya, showing up here, this is an IOB region, showing L-bursts, these probabilities of L-bursts, probabilities of S-bursts, and of course the darker area is the higher probability, and down here is the lower part of the IOB region where he's got his S and N bursts. This was an event, a beautiful event in October of last year. You can see that it stretched for pretty near 7 minutes. It occurred down here in this lower section of IOB, right where it's, they are predicted to occur, now in this section down here. Here's another one from November, about a month later. Again, you can see that it's down in this region here. Now, if we take a look at all of the N events that we've observed in the 2013 and 2014 Jupiter season, this is where they've all occurred. And this is a little animation showing you the locations that Jupiter was during each of those N events. And for the most part, you can see that they're right here. Got a couple of strays up there, but for the most part, and you'll also notice nothing here in the center of the IOB region. Nothing. All right, let's move on to IOC N events. Here's an IOC N event. This is another IOC event, December 2013. And again, for each of these, please note the location of Jupiter in the IOC emission region. This picture was courtesy of Dave's. All right, here's another animation showing the location of Jupiter for each of the N events in the IOC emission region from this past season. Doesn't seem to be any specific place like the IOB, but we didn't have very many IOC N event emissions this year. This is what the subgroup ended up seeing, what we were able to plot out, and pretty much exactly as what we would expect. The N events in the lower section of the B region and the C region. But what the heck are these? Well, if you remember earlier from my talk, I mentioned that if we go back and look, the N events have classically been limited to the IOB, IOC region. But you notice I've got a question mark down there in the non-IOC region. We've got a couple of events, this being one of them, and Jupiter was clear down here in the non-IOC. We've got another event down here where, again, Jupiter is not in the IOC emission region. We don't know what they are. There's something called an S-burst train, and you saw this same image earlier in dipstock. S-burst trains are long, narrow bands of S-burst emissions. And again, down here, a long train of S-burst emissions. Well, this all comes down to a question of resolution. And that's what I ended up with as the bottom line of looking into N events. Once upon a time, all of these terms were associated with events that were seen with low resolution equipment. But as technology has increased and gotten better, and our resolution has gotten better, the terminology or the terms are starting now to become a little, okay, they're starting to become a little shaky as to exactly what's what. We take a look, for example, of this event. Now, is this an N event or is this an S-burst train? If you look at it in detail, this is with the high-speed receiver, the wideband receiver. That event is made up of S-bursts. And you can see the S-burst very clearly in here. And this is, again, a 200 and, where's my hitman? 210 milliseconds. This is 210 milliseconds of a slice of that event right there. So, of that 210 milliseconds, we've got S-bursts. We've got mostly S-bursts. This is another slice of that event. And here's another slice of that same event that seems to be almost all L-bursts. So what do we call this thing? Is it an N event? Is it an S train? What is it? Here's an event from January 30th. And again, it looks like an N event. Clear up here. Well, let's take some slices out of that. That's pure L-burst. That's a 210 millisecond slice of that event, and that's pure L-burst. Here's another 210 millisecond slice, pure L-burst. So what's an N event? I've got a clue. I don't, and I don't think very many people else do. And what's generating them? No clue. Some ideas, some theories, but N events are a mystery. And I thought about this quite a bit. And I think the bottom line is that's why we do this. We talk a lot about hardware. We talk a lot about software. We talk a lot about antennas and building and what have you. But the reason that we do this is because somebody is asking what, how, and why. And if you stop and ask what, how, and why, you've got your feet on the path of science. And that's the message that we try to get across to the kids and other people. So we want you to think. There's no answer here. At least I couldn't find one. And Lord knows Dick Flagg. I was on the phone to him for hours talking about this and discussing this. And we both came to the conclusion that as time is progressing, these terms are starting to get nebulous because the technology is getting better. We're seeing more detail. We're seeing better things. I have no idea where this is going to go. But that's my talk.
Excuse me. First, I want to comment to the Radio Jove team that if your objective was to stimulate interest this week, you've certainly done that. My question is, how stable is the oil plasma torus? Does it eject filaments of plasma that just kind of disappear?
I'm an educator. I know enough math, to know I don't know much math, and I also know enough math to get myself into some really deep trouble. I will leave those questions to the guys back there. That's their specialty.